Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here. In this tutorial, I'd like to walk you through some new features you'll find in Red Giant Complete. We've added some new geometry options to Trapcode Mirror, Trapcode Form, and Trapcode Particular. And specifically, we've added the ability to work with Cinema 4D geometry natively. So I'd like to walk you through the best practices of working with geometry and objects in Cinema 4D and getting those into After Effects for use with Trapcode. The first thing we'll start with is getting this mobile phone from Cinema 4D over to After Effects. And as you can see, we've got some lighting, reflectivity, as well as a video that we've put right into the reflection map of the phone. Now, this phone actually comes from the content browser in Cinema 4D. So if you go to the Presets 3D Objects Volume 1 under Electronics and Technology, you'll find this mobile phone right there. If you're not seeing any objects in your presets section, such as 3D Objects Volume 1 or Volume 2, you might need to go to Help and check for updates, and you'll likely see the downloads in that window right there. Now, the objects in the content browser maintain a relative scale to each other. In other words, if I go in and load a human, you'll see that the person is actually relative to the size of the smartphone, which is generally a good thing. But if we're just working with this cell phone, I'm going to go to the scale and scale this object up by 10. Now, there's two main sets of steps that we have to do to get all of the geometry and all of the textures from a very complex object like this over to After Effects and Trapcode. And it might not seem like a complex object, but as I twirl this open, we see that we've got a mix of polygons and procedural objects, as well as other objects inside deformers, such as this glass that's inside a subdivision surface object. So we need to get all of this stuff into one object. And the reason we need to do that is we need to take that one object and bake one complete texture map. So, first thing you want to do is select all of the objects. Now, everything here is in one group. So if I select the group and I go to select children, it will select all of the stuff inside the group. Next, I'll go to object and select connect objects plus delete. And this is going to take all of that geometry and put it into one polygon object. Now, we've got a bunch of polygon selections and a bunch of materials that are applied to all those selections. Now, currently, Trapcode is really just going to want to see one complete texture map, and it cannot dissect all of these individual texture maps. So we'll need to take all of this stuff and make one texture map. So I'll select this object, go to Object, Bake Object. I want a single texture, so make sure to set that. The default size is pretty small, so I've turned those up to 2048 by 2048. I'm using a PNG as the format, and I've specified the output path name. Click on Bake. Once it has completed, you'll see a map of the different textures in here. You might have noticed when we merged everything together as one texture, that chrome bezel kind of went away. And that's because all of the materials are now sharing one set of properties. So we can't add different reflectivity to this section of the object because it is all one material. And in fact, we'll need to get rid of this phone right here, because we just want the geometry of this object right here, the one that has been baked. Just to keep things clean and organized, you could even go to delete unused materials, and we'll see that we're only using one texture map right here. Next, I'll just save my scene. Now I'll go to import and import the Cinema 4D scene. And we can do this because After Effects does support Cinema 4D files and will render the scene using the Cineware renderer. Instead of using the Cineware renderer, we're going to use Trapcode Mirror. So I'll turn this layer off, create a new solid, and call this Mirror. We'll go to Effect, Trapcode Mirror, Mirror 3. I'll twirl open geometry, and in the base geometry setting, This used to be plane and OBJ, and now this is 3D model. So we can go down here to the 3D model settings, select the mobile phone Cinema 4D file. And it's rendering the phone. It's actually kind of flat to the camera, so I'll click on create null. And I can orient this around using that null attachment. And in Mirror, I could either go in and just add a material here, but we already generated that UV map for our phone. So let's go in here, select the mobile phone surface color that we generated. I'll drop this into my composition and turn it off. Go to Mirror, and in the texture section, I'll select the phone surface color map. And this will go right on the surface of the phone. Now, I mentioned it's kind of like a dark on darker dark. So let's add some lights to kind of delineate where the different features are on this phone. In fact, to position my lights, I'm going to zero things out here. Go to my top view, turn on transparency. And let's create a camera. So let's get a feel for where the camera is, where the object is, and where my lights are. So my camera is here, my object is there. So if I spin it 90 degrees this way, and 90 degrees that way, it's flat to the camera. I'll put a light over here, I'll duplicate it. I'll move this light over to the other side, duplicate again, and then I'll move it behind. So we've got 3 lights illuminating the surface. So as I look at this from different angles, if I orbit my camera around, we can see that we've got the back and the front. So what I did for the original example that I showed you was place an image inside the same layer used for the surface color. So I'm just going to pre-compose that, Shift-Command-C or Shift-Control-C. I want to see this composition, the mobile phone, as well as the texture map. So I'm going to lock this composition, click on this link right up here that will bring up the composition that contains the texture map. So if I drop in some stock footage, I'll just import a video right here, and I'll drop this video right into the texture map, angle this, and put this in the right position. I've done this a few times, so I have a pretty good idea where the video should be placed. I also added some color to change where that bezel ring is. It's surprisingly easy. If I just create a shape that is where that bezel is, and that's actually right here, I can position this and add a different color for that bezel around the phone. It just takes a little bit of positioning. There. In fact, we don't need a stroke on this. I'll just keep it a fill, and I'll keep this kind of a dark bluish gray. There, I can close that one out now. And there we have it. I can scale it up, rotate it, animate this null around. One thing you might be seeing are these edges right here. I'm going to clean up this render by going to the rendering settings right here and turning super sample up to, let's say, about 16. That should get things nice and clean. So that's one workflow, and that might feel very similar to using OBJs in the past, where you had to export it, bake the geometry, bake the UV maps. So let's get into some workflows that are actually going to be more beneficial for you in terms of using Cinema 4D and Trapcode together. So let's go back to Cinema 4D and go into the content browser, and I'll load another object from electronics and technology, and I'll use the laptop. Now, in a case where I don't really need the UV mapping, the process of saving this file actually gets a lot more simplified. So I've got this laptop, and I'll save the scene here. I'll just go to Save As, Laptop. Now, this laptop, just like the phone, has a lot of complexities in it. There's polygons and procedural objects in here. So I'm going to go to File, and say Save Project for Cineware. So this will save the contents of the file in a slightly different format so that Cineware can see all the geometry. So I'll import the laptop, the Cineware version, drop this into a new comp, and there's the render. I'll make a new solid for Trapcode form and apply the Trapcode form effect. And just like mirror, we can go to the base form and set it to use the Cinema 4D geometry. So I'll go to base form, set this to a 3D model. In the 3D model settings, set the model to use the laptop. Now this was a lot fewer steps because we didn't have to bake everything down and get that UV map. So in this case, we can maybe dial down the density a little bit, and maybe we can give it sort of a X-ray kind of feel. I'll set this to kind of a light blue. I'll set the particles to add. Maybe we'll even generate the particles from the volume of the laptop. I'll set the particle size to 1. Let me rotate this around. So that process is actually quite simple in terms of getting the geometry from Cinema 4D right over into After Effects. Now, another benefit to using the Cinema 4D file format is where you have animation. And this is where we have a huge benefit over using OBJs, because anytime we had animated content with OBJs, you had to export it as an OBJ sequence. And in fact, Cinema 4D natively doesn't even support exporting of OBJ sequences. You had to use a third-party utility. So in this case, I just have a couple of text layers. This is using the MoGraph MoText object. And in both of these, I just typed in some words here. 2 objects in here, and they just animate in using a couple of keyframes. So if I bring up my timeline here, you can see that they both fly in, mostly using the Z-axis. There's a little bit of X-axis to actually avoid exactly what's happening right now, which is the object is intersecting with the camera. I'll move that around there. So those fly in, and let's say we want to use this with both Trapcode Mirror and Trapcode Particular to emit some particles from the actual text. For this to work, I must save this as a Cineware project. So I'll go to File, Save Project for Cineware, and we'll call this Dynamic Text, CW. Let's go back to After Effects, and we'll import Dynamic Text CW. Now, one thing you'll notice with the native version of the file, size is 174 kilobytes. The Cineware version is 7.7 megabytes. You'll notice that it's storing a lot more of the geometry and other data that it needs for Cineware to dynamically read the animation and geometry of the scene. So now with this imported, I'll drop this into a new composition. We'll see that Cineware is rendering this just fine. Let's get Trapcode Mirror rendering this. So I'll create a solid for Mirror. And under Effect, Trapcode Mirror 3. Geometry, 3D Model, 3D Model Settings, Dynamic Text, CW. Let's uncheck Normalize. This is a good illustration of what happens when we uncheck Normalize versus leaving Normalize on. After Effects has a space where the center of the world is the center of the composition. So in this case, with a 720p comp, the halfway point is 640 and 360. Cinema 4D and just about every other 3D application I can think of uses 0, 0, 0 as the center of the world for X, Y, and Z. So the difference with this normalize option is that unchecking it actually puts it in the correct location, which is 0, 0, 0. But I've not created a camera. It's using the After Effects sort of default camera where we actually haven't created a camera. The short explanation I'm not making here is that we need to extract the camera from that Cinema 4D scene. So with this scene selected, if I click on Extract, It's going to extract the camera. Now this camera is looking at 0, 0, 0, and therefore our scene lines back up. Hopefully that makes sense. Essentially normalize offsets it for the world space of After Effects, which does not use a center of 0, 0, 0. So I'll turn off the Cineware scene. And now we've got Trapcode Mirror rendering our model. And we don't need any UV mapping or anything like that. We just need to define the material. So I'll go into our presets here. I'll select the Satin Finish preset. And I'll create a background for it as well. So we mentioned getting particles from particular off of our 3D geometry. So I'll go to Trapcode Particular. Just like with form, we can go to the emitter and say that the emitter is now a 3D model. We'll use the 3D model settings and change this to the dynamic text. Uncheck normalize. And we can see that we've got particles starting to come off of the surface of the model. I'll turn up the number of particles per second, maybe not that much. Let's say 2,000. I'll turn down the particle size. Add some size random. Let's lower the lifespan, maybe to 1.5. And randomize the lifespan as well. Now, if you've worked with 3D geometry as emitters before, you know that having a velocity that makes them move away from their original point does make it difficult to actually see the shape of the emitter. So I'll set this to a low velocity, and we can see that we've got particles actually starting to emit in the shape of that geometry. If I turn this up. Now from here, I could add some wind or gravity. I'll have the wind in the physics section under air. Blow the particles actually toward the camera a little bit. And let's turn on motion blur for these. So I'll have these kind of blowing at the camera a little bit. Probably could use just a slightly darker background. So I'm actually just going to add a gradient ramp on here. Let's swap the colors, set this to a radial ramp, and pick some just slightly darker colors. I still think our particles could be even smaller. There we go. So there we go. 3 different uses for getting Cinema 4D files over to After Effects for use with Trapcode. You can count on a lot more development happening in terms of Cinema 4D and Trapcode integration in the future. This is certainly just a very small first step. My name is Harry Frank for Red Giant. We'll see you in the next tutorial.